Mia Bennett's hand froze on the door handle when she heard laughter coming from inside her own apartment. A woman's laughter, soft and familiar in a way that made her stomach twist before her mind could even understand why. She had taken an earlier flight home. The client meeting in Denver had ended a full day ahead of schedule, and instead of calling to say she was on her way back, she had wanted to surprise Daniel with the good news herself. She pictured his face lighting up when she walked through the door. She pictured pouring 2 glasses of wine and telling him that the contract had closed early and that they finally had one less thing to worry about before the wedding. She had smiled the entire ride home from the airport. Now her smile was gone. She stood on the small landing outside apartment 14, her suitcase handle still gripped in her fingers, and she listened. The laughter came again, low and playful, followed by Daniel's voice, warm in a way he rarely sounded with her anymore. Mia told herself it could be a friend. It could be his sister visiting from out of town. It could be a dozen harmless things, and for 3 full seconds she almost convinced herself to knock instead of using her key, to give whoever was inside the courtesy of announcing herself first. Instead, something colder and more certain moved through her, a feeling she would later describe as her body knowing the truth before her mind was ready to accept it. She slid her key into the lock as quietly as she could and pushed the door open. The living room was empty. A bottle of wine sat open on the kitchen counter, 2 glasses beside it, one smudged with pink lip gloss that was not her shade. Mia set her suitcase down without a sound and walked further inside, past the kitchen, past the small hallway table where a pair of unfamiliar heels sat neatly by the wall, as though their owner had every right to leave them there. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The bedroom door was half open. Mia did not remember deciding to walk toward it. Her feet simply carried her, one step and then another, until she was standing in the doorway looking at a sight that would replay in her mind for months to come. Daniel was there, and so was Chloe Barnes, the woman Mia had chosen months earlier to stand beside her on her wedding day, the woman who had helped her pick out her dress, who had cried happy tears with her at the bridal shop, who had promised to give a speech at the reception about how perfect Daniel and Mia were for each other. Neither of them noticed her at first. Mia stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, watching the 2 people she trusted most in the world betray her in the place she had once called home. It was Chloe who saw her first. Her face went white and she scrambled backward, grabbing for a shirt that was not hers to grab. Daniel turned, and for one terrible moment, his expression was not shame or panic, but simple, blank surprise, as though the greatest inconvenience of the moment was that Mia had come home a day too soon. "Mia," he said, and even his voice sounded rehearsed, as if some part of him had always known this conversation was coming and had quietly prepared an excuse for it. "This isn't what it looks like." Mia almost laughed. It was such an ordinary thing to say, such a tired and predictable line, that for a strange moment she felt as though she were watching a scene from a bad movie rather than living through the worst moment of her own life. She did not scream. She did not throw anything, though later she would wonder why she hadn't. She simply looked at him, and then at Chloe, who would not meet her eyes, and she felt something inside her chest close like a door being shut and locked from the other side. "Get out," Mia said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Both of you." "Mia, please let me explain." "I said get out." Chloe was already gathering her things, moving quickly, refusing to look at Mia even once as she hurried past her and out of the bedroom. Mia heard the front door open and close a few seconds later. Daniel remained, standing there in a way that made it clear he still believed there was some version of the next 5 minutes where he could talk his way out of what she had just seen with her own eyes. "How long?" Mia asked. Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. "It doesn't matter," she said, cutting him off before he could answer. "Just tell me one thing. Were you ever going to marry me, or was this always going to happen eventually?" "Mia, I love you. This was a mistake. A stupid, terrible mistake, and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." She looked around the bedroom they had shared for 2 years, at the framed photo of the 2 of them from their trip to the coast, at the closet where her wedding dress hung wrapped in plastic, waiting for a day that was now 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. She had spent the last 4 months planning every detail of that day, choosing flowers, tasting cakes, writing thank you notes in advance for gifts they had not yet received. She had built an entire future in her mind, brick by brick, and in the space of 5 minutes she had watched it collapse into nothing. "I need you to leave," she said quietly. "Tonight, I don't want to hear explanations, I don't want to hear apologies, I just need you to leave." "This is still my apartment too, Mia." "Then I'll leave," she said, and something in her tone made him go quiet. She picked her suitcase back up, the same one she had wheeled home with such excitement only minutes before, and walked out of the bedroom, down the hallway, past the wine glasses still sitting on the counter, and out the front door. She did not cry until she reached her car in the parking garage. Then she sat behind the wheel, gripping it with both hands, and let the tears come in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years, deep, shaking sobs that left her exhausted and hollow. She thought about calling her sister but could not bring herself to say the words out loud yet, not even to someone she trusted completely. She thought about calling her mother and immediately dismissed the idea, knowing her mother would want to drive over that same night, and Mia did not have the strength to comfort anyone else's shock on top of her own. Instead, she sat in the dark garage for nearly an hour, replaying the last 2 years of her relationship with Daniel, searching for signs she had missed, moments that should have warned her. There had been late nights at the office that she never questioned. There had been a growing distance in the past few months that she had blamed on wedding stress rather than anything more serious. There had been Chloe's sudden closeness with Daniel at dinners and parties, the two of them sharing private jokes that Mia had found sweet at the time, evidence, she had thought, that her best friend and her fiancé got along so well. She felt something close to disgust at her own blindness, though even as the thought formed, she pushed it away. She had not done anything wrong. She had trusted the people closest to her, and that trust had been used against her. There was no shame in that, even if it did not feel that way in the moment. Eventually, with her hands still trembling slightly on the wheel, Mia started the car and drove to the one place she knew she could go without having to explain anything right away. Her sister Rachel lived 20 minutes across town in a small house with a porch light that was always left on for visitors. Mia had a key. She had never needed to use it in an emergency before tonight. When she pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for a single lamp glowing in the front window. Mia sat in the car for a long moment, gathering whatever composure she had left, before finally stepping out and walking to the door. She let herself in quietly, not wanting to wake anyone, and made her way to the guest room at the end of the hall, the same room she had stayed in years earlier during a difficult stretch after college. She set her suitcase down beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, still wearing the same clothes she had traveled home in that morning, a lifetime ago it seemed now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Daniel, then another. She turned the screen face down without reading them and set it on the nightstand. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily, marking the passing minutes of what was now the worst night of her life. Mia lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange numbness that comes after a shock too large to process all at once. Tomorrow she would have to think about the wedding that would not happen, the deposits already paid, the guests who needed to be told, the life she had built around a man who had never truly valued it the way she had. Tonight she allowed herself only to breathe, to exist in the wreckage without trying yet to build anything new out of it. She did not know, as she finally closed her eyes sometime near dawn, that the life waiting for her on the other side of this heartbreak would look nothing like the one she had lost, and that a stranger she had not yet met would soon change the course of everything that came next. Morning came too fast. Mia woke to the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway and the quiet sound of her sister moving around the kitchen, trying not to wake her. For a few seconds, lying there in the unfamiliar softness of the guest bed, she forgot why she was there. Then the memory returned all at once, heavy and complete, and she pressed her palms against her eyes and lay still until she could breathe normally again. Rachel appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still in her robe, holding 2 mugs. She took one look at Mia's face and set both mugs down on the dresser before crossing the room and sitting beside her on the bed. "What happened?" Rachel asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer was bad. Mia told her everything: the flight home early, the laughter behind the door, Chloe's shoes by the wall, the sight of the 2 people she trusted most standing together in a place that used to be safe. She spoke in a flat, careful voice, the way people describe an accident they walked away from, still not quite believing they survived it. Rachel listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening more with every detail, until finally she reached over and pulled Mia into a hug so tight it almost hurt. "You're staying here," Rachel said firmly. "As long as you need, I mean it." Mia nodded against her sister's shoulder, grateful beyond words that she did not have to ask. The days that followed blurred together in a strange, mechanical rhythm. Mia called the florist first, her voice shaking only slightly as she explained that the wedding would no longer be taking place. The florist was kind, offering condolences that felt both genuine and slightly rehearsed, as though this was not the first cancellation call she had ever received. Next came the caterer, then the photographer, then the small string quartet Mia had booked for the ceremony after hearing them play at a friend's engagement party. Each call chipped away at something inside her, a small, private funeral for a future that would now never exist. The hardest call was to her mother. Mia had put it off for 2 full days, unable to find the words, unable to bear the thought of her mother's disappointment and worry combined into one conversation. When she finally dialed the number, her mother picked up on the second ring, her voice bright with the assumption that Mia was calling about wedding details. "Mom," Mia said, and something in the single word must have carried enough weight, because her mother went quiet immediately. "What's wrong?" Mia told her, more briefly than she had told Rachel, the details already feeling worn thin from repetition. Her mother was silent for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I never liked how he looked at other women at family dinners," her mother said. "I should have said something." "It wouldn't have changed anything, Mom." "Maybe not. But I'm sorry I didn't try." They talked for almost an hour, Mia curled up on Rachel's couch with a blanket over her knees, listening to her mother alternate between comforting words and quiet fury directed at a man she had once welcomed into the family. By the end of the call, Mia felt a little lighter, though the ache in her chest remained, dull and constant, like a bruise that had not yet finished forming. Daniel did not stop calling. In the first week alone, he left over a dozen voicemails, ranging from apologetic to pleading to, by the end of the week, faintly accusatory, as though Mia's refusal to answer was somehow another wrong being done to him. She listened to exactly 2 of the messages before deleting the rest unheard. In both of the ones she listened to, he spoke about stress, about feeling lost in the months leading up to the wedding, about a moment of weakness that did not reflect who he truly was. Mia noticed that he never once used the word sorry without immediately following it with an explanation, as though the apology needed to be earned back through justification rather than simply offered. It was during the second week that she learned the truth about the money. She had gone back to the apartment on a Saturday morning, timed carefully to avoid Daniel, who she knew had a standing basketball game with friends every weekend. She wanted to collect the rest of her belongings before the lease renewal came up, before she had to make any decisions about what happened to the apartment itself. While going through the small filing cabinet in the hallway closet, searching for a folder of important documents, she found the joint account statements Daniel had printed months earlier and never bothered to shred. At first she scanned them absently, more concerned with finding her passport and birth certificate than with the numbers on the page. But something made her pause. A withdrawal for $800 listed simply as miscellaneous. Then another for $1,200 a week later. Then a third, larger still, dated only 10 days before her trip to Denver. Mia sat down slowly on the floor of the closet, statements spread across her lap, and began cross-referencing dates against her memory of the wedding planning timeline. The withdrawals did not match anything she remembered approving. They did not match vendor payments, deposit schedules, or any of the careful budget she had built in a spreadsheet months earlier. A spreadsheet Daniel had barely glanced at, claiming he trusted her completely with the numbers. She pulled out her phone and called the bank, sitting on the closet floor surrounded by old photographs and forgotten paperwork, and asked, in a voice that surprised her with its calm, for a detailed transaction history on the joint account going back 6 months. What she learned over the following hour, cross-referencing purchases against restaurant names and store locations she recognized, was almost worse than the affair itself. Nearly $4,000 of their shared wedding fund, money Mia had transferred faithfully from every paycheck for the better part of a year, had gone toward gifts, dinners, and a weekend hotel stay that lined up precisely with a work trip Daniel claimed to have taken alone. She thought of Chloe's new handbag, admired and complimented at a bridal shower just 2 months earlier. She thought of the necklace Chloe had worn to a dinner party, the one she claimed her mother had given her for her birthday. Mia felt something shift inside her chest, the last soft edges of grief hardening into something closer to clarity. This had not been a single mistake, a moment of weakness born from stress, as Daniel kept insisting. This had been planned, funded, and hidden with a level of care that a man overwhelmed by sudden temptation simply would not have managed. He had built an entire second life alongside the one he was supposedly building with her, and he had used her own money, money she had worked overtime shifts and skipped vacations to save, to do it. Mia gathered the statements carefully, along with her passport and a small box of items she did not want to leave behind, and left the apartment without waiting for Daniel's return. She drove straight to a small coffee shop 2 blocks from Rachel's house, ordered a drink she barely touched, and sat by the window making a list on a paper napkin of everything she now needed to do. Contact a lawyer about the joint account, change her passwords, speak to their mutual friends before Daniel had the chance to shape the story in his own favor. The list grew longer with every passing minute, but writing it down gave her something solid to hold onto, a plan in the middle of chaos. When she told Rachel about the money that evening, her sister's reaction was immediate and fierce. "You need to talk to someone," Rachel said. "A lawyer, at least for the account. That money is half yours, and if he spent it deceiving you, you deserve to know your options." "I don't want to fight him over money, Rachel. I just want it to be over." "I understand that, but wanting peace doesn't mean you have to accept being taken advantage of. There's a difference between moving on and letting someone walk away with what's yours." Mia knew her sister was right, even if the thought of a legal battle, however small, exhausted her more than she had energy to admit. Over the next several days, with Rachel's encouragement, she met with a lawyer recommended by a coworker, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Priya who reviewed the account statements with a practiced eye and assured Mia that recovering a portion of the misused funds was well within reach, given the clear documentation. The process would take weeks, possibly longer, but simply having a plan in motion gave Mia a small foothold to stand on. She began sleeping slightly better, though grief still crept in during quiet moments, in the middle of folding laundry, in the parking lot of the grocery store, in the seconds right before sleep when her mind wandered without permission back to the life she had lost. At work, she threw herself into long shifts at the boutique she managed, grateful for the distraction of inventory counts and customer questions, and the simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of helping someone find the right dress for an occasion that had nothing to do with her own broken plans. Her manager, noticing the shift in her energy, quietly offered her extra hours without asking too many questions, and Mia accepted every one of them, filling her days so completely that there was little room left for the ache that waited for her at night. Word of the breakup spread quickly through their shared circle of friends, as these things always do. Some reached out with kindness, offering to bring food or simply sit with her in silence. Others, to Mia's quiet disappointment, seemed unsure how to respond, caught between old loyalty to Daniel and sympathy for her, ultimately choosing silence as the easiest path. She learned, in that strange and painful way heartbreak often teaches, exactly which friendships had been built on convenience and which ones were real. Chloe never reached out at all, not even a message of apology, which somehow hurt in a different way than the betrayal itself. A final confirmation that the friendship had meant far less to Chloe than it ever had to Mia. 3 weeks after the discovery, Mia sat once again on Rachel's couch, staring at a wedding dress bag she had finally worked up the courage to open, deciding what to do with a gown she would never wear. She ran her fingers along the delicate lace at the sleeve, remembering the day she had tried it on for the first time, the tears of happiness in her mother's eyes, the certainty she had felt that this was the beginning of the rest of her life. She zipped the bag closed again, unable to decide anything yet, and set it carefully in the back of Rachel's closet, out of sight but not entirely out of mind. Some decisions, she was learning, could not be rushed, no matter how much she wanted the pain of indecision to end. For now, survival meant simply getting through each day. One shift, one phone call, one quiet evening at a time, trusting that eventually the sharp edges of this loss would soften into something she could carry without breaking under the weight of it. She did not yet know that her days of scraping by on extra shifts were numbered, or that an unexpected evening working at a hotel cafe she had only taken on for the additional pay would soon place her, quite by accident, in the path of a man whose presence would begin to change everything she thought she understood about starting over. 6 weeks after the night that ended her engagement, Mia's life had settled into a routine built almost entirely around exhaustion. She worked her regular hours at the boutique during the day. Then 3 evenings a week she picked up shifts at a cafe inside one of the city's most upscale hotels. A job she had taken purely for the extra income now that she was covering rent on her own small apartment, paying down the last of the wedding deposits she had lost when vendors refused refunds, and slowly rebuilding a savings account that had been drained without her knowledge or consent. The new apartment was smaller than the one she had shared with Daniel, tucked on the 3rd floor of an older building with a temperamental radiator and a view of a brick wall instead of a park. But it was hers alone, and there was a strange comfort in that. No shared closet space holding someone else's secrets. No joint accounts to monitor for unexplained withdrawals. Just her own name on the lease, her own choices filling the small room's one piece of second-hand furniture at a time. Still, the financial strain wore on her. The lawyer Priya had made progress on recovering a portion of the misused wedding funds, but the process moved slowly, tangled in paperwork and Daniel's reluctance to cooperate, dragging out weeks longer than either of them had hoped. In the meantime, Mia's bank balance dipped lower with each passing month, and the extra shifts at the hotel cafe, while exhausting, made the difference between comfortable and barely managing. The cafe itself was elegant in a quiet, understated way, all soft lighting and pale marble counters, frequented by hotel guests, business travelers, and the occasional local who appreciated the good coffee and quiet atmosphere away from the noise of the lobby. Mia had learned quickly that the clientele expected a certain polish, a calm efficiency that masked whatever chaos might be happening in an employee's personal life. She had gotten good at performing that calm, even on nights when her hands trembled slightly from fatigue or her eyes stung from unshed tears. She refused to release during her shift. It was on a particularly difficult Thursday evening, nearly 2 months to the day since she had walked in on Daniel and Chloe, that everything came to a head. The lawyer had called that afternoon with disappointing news, Daniel's attorney contesting the claim on the wedding fund with a series of technicalities that would delay any resolution by at least another month. Mia had taken the call during her lunch break at the boutique, standing in the small back room among boxes of unpacked inventory, and had barely managed to hold herself together until the call ended. By the time her evening shift at the cafe began, she was running on fumes, her mind foggy with stress, her body aching from a full day on her feet. The cafe was busier than usual that night, a corporate conference having filled most of the hotel's rooms with guests who wandered down for a late coffee or a quiet drink after long days of meetings. Mia moved between tables and the counter with practiced efficiency, taking orders, delivering drinks, clearing tables, her smile fixed in place even as exhaustion pulled at every part of her. Around 8 in the evening, a new guest settled into a corner table near the window. A man who ordered a black coffee and a slice of the cafe's lemon tart, requesting both with a politeness that stood out among the more brusque business travelers Mia had grown used to serving that evening. He was perhaps in his late 30s, dressed simply but well, in a dark wool coat and a sweater that looked expensive without shouting about it. He had opened a laptop on the small table and seemed absorbed in his work, occasionally glancing up at the window as though gathering his thoughts before diving back into whatever document held his attention. Mia delivered his order without incident, exchanging only the briefest pleasantries, and returned to the counter to handle a growing line of guests requesting drinks before an evening seminar. It was nearly 40 minutes later, as she carried a fresh pot of coffee toward the man's table to offer a refill, that disaster struck. A server rushing past with a tray of empty glasses clipped her elbow just as she reached the table, and the pot tilted sharply in her hand. Hot coffee splashed across the table's edge and onto the sleeve of the man's coat, which he had draped over the back of his chair, as well as narrowly missing the laptop he had, thankfully, closed only moments earlier to check something on his phone. "Oh no, I am so sorry," Mia said, setting the pot down immediately and grabbing a stack of napkins from the counter, her heart sinking with a fresh wave of panic on top of the exhaustion already weighing on her. A stained coat that looked as expensive as this one probably was could easily cost her the shift's entire pay in restitution, and possibly more than that if the man decided to complain to management. The man looked down at his sleeve, then up at Mia, and for a moment she braced herself for the irritation she expected, the kind of sharp, dismissive anger she had occasionally encountered from guests over far smaller inconveniences. Instead, his expression remained calm, almost amused, as he took the napkins she offered and began blotting gently at the fabric himself. "It's only coffee," he said. "It happens, are you all right?" The question caught Mia off guard so completely that for a moment she simply stared at him, unsure how to respond. Guests did not usually ask if she was all right after she had made a mistake. Usually it was the opposite, an unspoken expectation that she absorb their frustration and apologize until the tension passed. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though her voice wavered slightly on the second word, betraying more than she intended. The man studied her for a moment, his dark eyes taking in details she suddenly felt very aware of, the faint shadows beneath her own eyes from too many sleepless nights, the tightness around her mouth that came from holding back tears all evening, the slight tremor in her hands as she continued dabbing uselessly at the coat sleeve. He set his own napkin down gently and met her gaze with an expression that was neither pity nor judgment, simply quiet attentiveness. "You don't look fine," he said, not unkindly. "Long shift." Mia laughed, a short, surprised sound that held very little humor in it. "Long few months, honestly. I'm sorry about your coat. I'll go get the manager. We can arrange for cleaning or replacement if it's stained." "It's fine," he said again, echoing her own word back with a small, reassuring smile. "Truly, it's an old coat. It survived worse than coffee." Mia hesitated, unsure whether to accept his easy dismissal or insist on making things right through proper channels, the way she had been trained to handle any incident involving a guest's belongings. But something in his manner, calm and unbothered, made the offer feel genuine rather than performative. "At least let me bring you a fresh coffee on the house," she said, "and I really am sorry." "I'd like that," he said, "thank you." She hurried back to the counter to prepare a new pot, grateful for the brief moment away from the table to collect herself. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she worked, not entirely from the spilled coffee but from the accumulated weight of the day, the lawyer's disappointing call, the constant strain of rebuilding a life alone, the sheer exhaustion of performing composure for hours on end. She pressed the back of her hand briefly against her eyes, willing away the sting of tears that threatened again, and carried the fresh pot back to the man's table. As she poured, she noticed he had set his phone aside and was watching her with the same quiet attentiveness as before, not staring, exactly, but present in a way that felt different from the distracted glances she usually received from guests absorbed in their own concerns. "You don't have to talk about it," he said as she finished pouring, "but for what it's worth, whatever kind of few months you've had, it's clearly not written on a lack of effort. I've watched you handle this floor for the better part of an hour. You're good at what you do, even exhausted." The unexpected kindness of the observation landed somewhere Mia had not realized was still tender enough to be touched. She felt her throat tighten and blinked quickly, forcing a small smile. "Thank you," she managed. "That's kind of you to say." "I mean it," he said simply, and something about the directness of his tone told her he was not the type of man who offered compliments he did not believe. "Will there be anything else?" Mia asked, needing to retreat before the conversation went any further, before the careful composure she had built over the past 2 months cracked entirely in front of a stranger in a hotel cafe. "No, this is perfect, thank you." She nodded and moved on to her next table, grateful for the demands of the busy evening that kept her too occupied to dwell further on the strange, brief warmth of the exchange. When she glanced toward his table an hour later, gathering empty cups and preparing the section for closing, she found it empty, the man having settled his bill and left without her noticing his departure. On the table, beneath the saucer of his empty coffee cup, she found a folded napkin with a note written in neat, unhurried handwriting. "Thank you for the coffee and for the conversation. I hope the rest of your week is easier than it seems to have been. You handled a difficult moment with more grace than most people manage on their best day." There was no name signed beneath the note, only the small, careful handwriting that suggested a person who chose his words with the same deliberate calm he had shown at the table. Mia read it twice, standing alone in the quiet cafe as the last few guests filtered out for the evening, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a small, unexpected warmth in the middle of a period of her life that had held very little of it. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, telling herself it meant nothing, that kind strangers passed through hotel cafes every day, and forgot the encounter within the hour. But as she finished closing out her section and gathered her things to leave for the night, she found herself thinking about the calm certainty in the man's voice when he told her it was only coffee, the way he had looked at her as though her exhaustion mattered, as though she was more than the efficient, invisible presence most guests preferred their servers to be. She did not know his name, she did not expect to see him again. But walking out into the cool night air toward the bus stop, her feet aching and her mind still turning over the strange kindness of a stranger, Mia allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something other than grief settle over the ache in her chest, something small and quiet, but undeniably present all the same. Rock bottom, she would think later, looking back on that evening, had a strange way of cracking open just enough light to remind a person that even the darkest stretches of a life do not last forever, that sometimes the smallest, most unexpected kindness could be the first thread pulling someone back toward the surface, even before they realized they had begun to rise. Mia did not expect to see the man from the corner table again, but 4 days later, on a quieter Monday evening shift, she looked up from wiping down the counter to find him settling into the same seat by the window, laptop bag over one shoulder. A different coat this time, dark gray instead of the one she had stained the week before. "You're back," she said, surprising herself with how easily the words came out, almost warm, before she remembered herself and reached for a more professional tone. "What can I get started for you?" "Black coffee, and whatever the lemon tarts competition is tonight," he said, settling into the chair with an ease that suggested he had already decided this small corner of the hotel cafe suited him. "I hear the coffee here comes with excellent service, minor spills notwithstanding." Mia laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh this time, not the strained, polite version she had been performing for months. "I promise to keep a firmer grip on the pot tonight." "I'll hold you to that," he said, and there was something easy in his smile that put her instantly at ease, a rare feeling given how careful she had become around new people since the collapse of her engagement. She brought his order a few minutes later, along with a slice of the chocolate torte the pastry chef had introduced that week on the house. She explained, as a small thank you for his graciousness over the coat. He accepted it with a genuine smile, and, As the evening slowed and her other tables emptied, invited her to join him for a few minutes if her manager didn't mind. Mia hesitated only briefly before pulling up the spare chair across from him, glancing toward the counter where her manager, absorbed in closing out the register, showed no sign of needing her immediate attention. "I never got your name," he said. "Last week, I mean. I was too busy being an inconvenience to ask properly." "Mia," she said. "Mia Bennett." "Nathaniel," he replied, extending a hand across the small table which she shook, noting the firm, unhurried quality of his grip. "It's nice to actually be introduced this time, instead of just being the man whose coat you ruined." "It wasn't ruined. You made that very clear." "It wasn't," he agreed. "Though I'll admit the note I left might have been a bit much. I don't usually do that sort of thing." "I liked the note," Mia admitted, surprising herself again with her own honesty. "It came at a good time." Something in her tone must have carried more weight than she intended, because Nathaniel's expression shifted slightly, curious but careful not to press. "Rough stretch." Mia considered deflecting, the way she had grown practiced at doing with well-meaning coworkers and distant acquaintances who asked about her life out of politeness rather than genuine interest. But something about Nathaniel's calm, unhurried patience made her want to answer honestly, at least in part. "I was supposed to get married a couple of months ago," she said. "It didn't happen. Long story and not a particularly original one, unfortunately." "I'm sorry," he said, and the simplicity of the response, no probing questions, no awkward attempts to fill the silence with reassurances, felt like exactly the right thing to say. "Those are hard, no matter how the details go." "You sound like you know from experience." "A little," he said, something briefly guarded crossing his features before easing again. "It was a long time ago, different circumstances. But I remember what it does to a person, the way it makes you question things you thought you understood clearly." Mia studied him for a moment, curious despite herself about the story behind that brief flash of old pain, but she did not push, sensing that whatever he had lived through was not something offered easily to strangers, however friendly the conversation had become. "What do you do?" she asked instead, steering toward safer ground. "When you're not haunting hotel cafes and rescuing coffee spills from becoming diplomatic incidents." Nathaniel smiled at that, a genuine, easy expression that reached his eyes. "I work in finance mostly, investments, some consulting. It's less glamorous than it sounds, mostly a lot of spreadsheets and meetings that could have been emails." "That sounds exhausting." "It is some days. This is actually one of the better parts of my week, honestly. Quiet corner, good coffee, no one asking me to explain quarterly projections." Mia laughed again, more easily this time, and found herself relaxing into the conversation in a way she had not expected. They talked for nearly 20 minutes before her manager called her back to the counter for a group of guests checking in from a delayed flight. And as she stood to leave, Nathaniel caught her eye one more time. "I travel through this hotel fairly often for work," he said. "I hope it's all right if I stop by again." "I'd like that," Mia said and meant it. Over the following weeks, his visits became a familiar, welcome pattern in her evening shifts. He did not come every night, but often enough that she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to look forward to the possibility of finding him at the corner table when her shift began. Their conversations grew longer and easier with each visit, ranging from small, comfortable topics, favorite books, terrible childhood vacations, the merits and flaws of various coffee blends, to deeper ones that surprised her with how naturally they emerged. She told him in careful pieces over several evenings more of what had happened with Daniel, the discovery, the money taken from their shared savings, the friend who had betrayed her alongside him. Nathaniel listened without judgment, occasionally offering a quiet observation that helped her see the situation from an angle she had not considered. But mostly he simply listened, giving her the rare gift of being heard without being fixed or managed. In turn, though more sparingly, he shared pieces of his own past, an early marriage that had ended in a betrayal not unlike her own, though he offered few specifics, and a subsequent decade spent building a life that kept him too busy. He admitted with a wry smile to properly examine whether he was happy or simply occupied. "You never remarried?" Mia asked one evening, several weeks into their growing friendship, curious despite herself. "No," Nathaniel said. "Never found the right reason to try again, I suppose. Work became easier to trust than people, for a long while." "That sounds lonely." "It was, if I'm honest. Though lately," he said, glancing at her with an expression she could not quite read, "I've started to remember what it feels like to look forward to a conversation." Mia felt warmth rise in her cheeks and looked down at the table, unsure how to respond to the quiet weight behind his words. She was not ready, she reminded herself firmly, for anything beyond friendship, not with her heart still healing from a wound that had barely begun to close. But she could not deny that these evenings at the small corner table had become one of the few genuinely bright spots in a life still largely defined by rebuilding what had been broken. Nathaniel never asked for anything more than her company during these visits, never pushed for personal details beyond what she offered freely, never made her feel even once like an obligation or a project to be fixed. He simply showed up, week after week, steady and unhurried, offering conversation and quiet companionship without expectation. It was during one of these evenings, nearly a month into their growing friendship, that Mia finally worked up the nerve to ask a question that had been sitting at the back of her mind for weeks. "Can I ask you something?" she said, setting down the coffee she had poured for herself during a lull in the evening's business. "Of course. You never talk about specifics. Which company, what exactly you do day to day." "I don't need to know, obviously it's not my business. I'm just curious." Something flickered across Nathaniel's expression, brief and carefully controlled, before he answered. "It's not that I'm hiding anything from you, Mia. I just prefer, when I can, to be known for who I am in a conversation, not for what I do or what it might mean to someone. It's simpler that way. Fewer complications." "That's a very careful answer," Mia said, studying him. "It's an honest one," he replied. "I promise if it ever matters, I'll tell you everything you want to know." Mia let the answer settle, sensing there was more beneath it than he was ready to share, but not feeling any need to press further. Whatever careful walls Nathaniel kept around parts of his life, the version of him she had come to know over these weeks, patient, thoughtful, genuinely kind in ways that asked for nothing in return, felt real enough to trust, at least within the boundaries of the friendship they had built. She did not know, as she said goodnight to him that evening and watched him disappear through the hotel's grand front doors into the cool night air, that the careful vagueness in his answer had less to do with privacy for its own sake and more to do with a simple, quiet hope, one he had not yet found the courage to name even to himself, that whatever grew between them in this small, unassuming corner of a hotel cafe might have the chance to grow into something real before the weight of who he actually was ever entered the equation at all. By early autumn, the leaves along the street outside Mia's apartment had begun turning the deep orange and gold that signaled the season's shift, and with it came a shift in Mia's own life that she had not fully noticed until she caught herself smiling unprompted while walking to work one morning, the first time in months that happiness had arrived without her having to search for it. Her friendship with Nathaniel had settled into something steady and dependable, a fixed point in a life that had spent the better part of a year feeling anything but stable. He visited the cafe 2 or 3 times a week now, always arriving in the quieter hours of the evening, always leaving space for their conversation to unfold naturally rather than forcing it. Mia had stopped questioning why a man who claimed to work in finance seemed to have so much flexible time to sit in a hotel cafe several evenings a week, telling herself it was simply not her place to ask, and that perhaps his work allowed for it in ways she did not fully understand. The legal matter with Daniel had dragged on longer than anyone expected. Priya called one Tuesday afternoon with news that left Mia gripping the phone tightly, her knuckles white. "His attorney is offering a settlement," Priya said. "But it's low, Mia. Lower than what the documentation supports. I think they're betting you'll take it just to be done with the whole thing." Mia closed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her at the thought of prolonging a fight she had hoped would be over by now. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend we push back. The evidence is solid, but I want you to know it's your decision. If you need this resolved quickly for your own peace of mind, that's a valid reason to accept, even if it's not the outcome you deserve." Mia thanked her and ended the call, sitting for a long while afterward at her small kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. That evening, when she arrived at the cafe for her shift, she found Nathaniel already at his usual table, and something in her face must have given away her mood, because he set aside his laptop the moment she approached. "Bad day?" he asked. "Bad news," she corrected, and found herself, without entirely deciding to, telling him about the settlement offer, the exhaustion of the ongoing fight, the temptation to simply take the smaller amount and be free of the entire situation once and for all. Nathaniel listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something and you can tell me if it's overstepping?" "Go ahead." "Do you actually want the money? Or do you want the acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, and the money is just the only language he understands well enough to make that acknowledgement mean something?" Mia blinked, struck by the precision of the question, the way it cut straight to a feeling she had not managed to articulate even to herself. "The second one, I think." "Mostly." "Then don't take the low offer," Nathaniel said gently. "Not because of the money itself, but because settling for less sends a message, even if it's only a message to yourself, that what happened wasn't worth fighting for. You deserve better than a quiet, discounted apology dressed up as a settlement." Mia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the simple relief of being understood so clearly by someone who had no obligation to care this much about the outcome of her private legal matter. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I think I needed someone to say that out loud." "Any time," Nathaniel said, and the warmth in his voice settled something restless in her chest. She followed his advice, calling Priya the next morning to reject the settlement and push forward with the original claim. 2 weeks later, after a firmer round of negotiations that Priya handled with brisk efficiency, Daniel's attorney agreed to a settlement much closer to the actual amount taken from the joint account, a resolution that would not undo the pain of the betrayal, but did, at least, provide Mia with a measure of the closure and financial stability she had been fighting for. She celebrated the news in a small, quiet way, treating herself to a modest dinner out with Rachel, who raised a glass of wine in a toast to what she called the official end of the Daniel chapter of Mia's life. When Mia told Nathaniel the outcome during her next shift, his smile was so genuinely pleased, so entirely without self-interest, that she found herself studying his face longer than strictly necessary, noticing for the first time how much she had come to look forward to sharing news with him, good or bad. Their conversations continued to deepen through the following weeks. Nathaniel told her, in careful pieces, about his early marriage, a woman he had loved with the uncomplicated trust of someone young enough to believe love alone was sufficient protection against betrayal. She had left him for a colleague of his, he explained, during a stretch of years when he had been building the early foundation of his career, working long hours he had believed, at the time, were an investment in their shared future. "I used to think if I'd just been home more, paid more attention, it wouldn't have happened," he admitted one evening, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "It took me a long time to accept that her choices weren't a referendum on my worth. They were just her choices." "That's exactly what my sister keeps telling me," Mia said. "I'm still working on believing it." "It gets easier," Nathaniel said. "Not because the memory fades entirely, but because you build enough new, good memories around it that it stops being the loudest thing in the room." Mia thought about that phrase often in the days that followed, the idea of building enough new memories to quiet the old ones. She began noticing, almost without meaning to, how many of her recent good memories involved this quiet corner table, this steady, patient man who asked nothing of her beyond honest conversation. It was during a particularly cold evening in late October, The cafe nearly empty due to a sudden storm that had driven most guests to stay in their rooms, that their friendship shifted into something neither of them had quite named yet, though both, perhaps, had begun to sense its approach. Mia's manager had allowed her to close her section early given the slow business, and she found herself, for the first time, sitting across from Nathaniel not as an employee stealing a few minutes between tasks, but simply as herself, unhurried, with nowhere else she needed to be. "Can I ask you something a little more personal?" Nathaniel said, watching the rain streak down the window beside their table. "Depends how personal. Do you think you'll ever want to get married again, after everything?" Mia considered the question seriously, turning it over rather than offering the easy, defensive answer she might have given months earlier. "I used to think the answer was no, that I'd rather be alone than risk that kind of betrayal again. But lately," she said, glancing up to meet his eyes, "I've started thinking maybe the problem wasn't marriage itself. Maybe it was just the wrong person and the wrong kind of trust." "That's a fair distinction," Nathaniel said quietly, something warm and careful in his expression. "What about you, after everything with your ex-wife?" "I spent a long time telling myself I didn't need it," he admitted. "That work was enough, that I'd built a life that didn't require anyone else's presence to feel complete. But sitting here most evenings talking with you," he paused, choosing his next words with visible care, "I've started to wonder if I was only telling myself that because I hadn't found a reason yet to want something different." The rain continued outside the window, steady and soft, filling the quiet space between them as Mia absorbed the weight of what he had just admitted, careful and honest in a way that matched everything she had come to know about him over these past weeks. She did not respond immediately, not because she did not feel the pull of something new and hopeful stirring in her own chest, but because she wanted, for once, to trust her own judgment fully before leaping toward anything, wanted to be certain that what she felt was real, and not simply the natural gravity of gratitude toward the first person to treat her with genuine kindness after months of pain. "I'm not ready to rush into anything," she said finally, honestly. "Not because of you, because of me. I need to trust my own judgment again before I trust it with someone else's heart." "I understand completely," Nathaniel said, and the ease with which he accepted her honesty, without disappointment or pressure, only deepened the quiet trust growing steadily between them. "There's no timeline here, Mia. I'm not going anywhere." She believed him, sitting there in the rain-streaked quiet of the nearly empty cafe, in a way she had not allowed herself to believe anyone's promises in a very long time. Whatever this was building toward, friendship deepening slowly into something more. It felt different from anything she had known before, built not on grand gestures or hurried declarations, but on patience, honesty, and the simple, steady comfort of being truly seen by someone who asked for nothing in return, but the chance to keep showing up. She did not yet know how much more there was to learn about the man sitting across from her, the careful vagueness he still maintained about the true scope of his work, and the life he led beyond these quiet evening visits. But for now, in the warm, rain-softened light of the cafe, none of that mattered nearly as much as the simple truth that for the first time since the night her old life shattered, Mia Bennett was beginning, tentatively and honestly, to look forward to whatever came next. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the most unremarkable way possible, which somehow made it feel all the more jarring when it happened. Mia had a rare few hours between her boutique shift and her evening at the cafe, and she stopped at a small newsstand near the hotel to buy a magazine, something light to flip through during her break, a way to quiet her mind before the evening's work began. She settled into a chair in the hotel's quiet mezzanine lounge, coffee in hand, and opened the business magazine she had grabbed almost at random, drawn by a cover story about emerging trends in sustainable investing that had briefly caught her eye at the newsstand. She flipped through the opening pages absently, more interested in the photographs than the dense financial analysis, until she turned a page and stopped completely, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. There, in a two-page feature about influential private investors reshaping the city's financial landscape, was a photograph of Nathaniel. Not the Nathaniel she knew from quiet evening conversations at a corner cafe table, dressed casually, unhurried and approachable, but a sharper, more formal version, standing in what was clearly a boardroom, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his expression composed into the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to being photographed for publications exactly like this one. Mia read the caption twice before the words fully registered. Nathaniel Cross, founder and principal of Cross Capital Partners, one of the most closely watched private investment firms in the region, known for a portfolio that spanned real estate, emerging technology, and a growing philanthropic foundation that had quietly funded scholarship programs for underprivileged students across the state. Her hands had gone cold around the coffee cup. She read the article itself with growing disbelief, learning details she had never once heard from Nathaniel's own mouth across dozens of evening conversations. His firm managed assets valued in the hundreds of millions. He had been named, 2 years running, among the city's most influential business leaders under 50. The article described him, in language that felt almost surreal set against the man she had come to know, as notoriously private, rarely granting interviews, guarding his personal life with a discretion that had only fueled public curiosity about him further. Mia set the magazine down on the small table beside her chair and sat very still, trying to reconcile the two versions of the man now sitting uneasily side by side in her mind. The Nathaniel who asked thoughtful questions about her day, who had listened without judgment to every painful detail of her broken engagement, who had encouraged her to fight for what she deserved in her settlement with Daniel. That Nathaniel felt entirely real, entirely genuine. Someone she had come to trust with a depth she had not expected to feel again so soon after being betrayed by people she had trusted completely. But this Nathaniel, the one photographed in boardrooms, managing hundreds of millions of dollars, deliberately vague about his career in every single conversation they had shared, felt like a stranger she had never actually met. She felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest, a familiar, unwelcome echo of the same feeling she had experienced the night she discovered Daniel's betrayal, the sickening realization that someone she trusted had been keeping something significant hidden from her. It was not the same kind of betrayal, she told herself immediately, trying to be fair even through the shock. Nathaniel had never lied outright. He had simply declined to elaborate, offering the vague explanation that he preferred to be known for himself rather than his position. But sitting there in the mezzanine lounge, the magazine open on the table beside her, Mia could not shake the discomfort of having spent months sharing her most vulnerable moments with a man whose full identity she had never actually known. Had he been laughing quietly to himself each time she wondered aloud how he had so much free time for a demanding finance job? Had every kind gesture, every thoughtful piece of advice, been colored by a wealth and power she had no idea he possessed? She thought of the settlement advice he had given her weeks earlier, and a new, uncomfortable question surfaced. Had that advice come from genuine care, or from the easy confidence of a man who had never once had to worry about money, and could not fully appreciate what it meant for someone in her position to walk away from even a modest settlement? By the time her shift began that evening, Mia had worked herself into a quiet, simmering unease that she could not entirely name or dismiss. When Nathaniel arrived at his usual table an hour later, greeting her with the same warm, easy smile he always wore, she found herself unable to match his ease, her responses clipped and distracted in a way that clearly did not go unnoticed. "Is everything all right?" he asked, after she had delivered his coffee with barely a word exchanged between them. "Fine," Mia said, the same automatic deflection she had once used the night they met, though this time Nathaniel did not accept it as easily. "Mia," he said gently, "you can talk to me, whatever it is." She hesitated, torn between the instinct to retreat into polite distance and the deeper honesty that had come to define their friendship over the past months. Finally, she pulled the folded magazine from her apron pocket, where she had tucked it earlier, unable to fully set it aside, and placed it on the table in front of him, open to the page with his photograph. Nathaniel's expression shifted immediately, understanding dawning alongside something that looked almost like resignation, as though he had known this moment would eventually arrive, and had simply hoped for more time before it did. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly. "You should have told me at all," Mia replied, her voice tighter than she intended. "Months, Nathaniel. We've talked almost every week for months, and I didn't even know your last name properly until I read it in a magazine at a newsstand." "I know how that looks," he said. "I promise you it wasn't about hiding anything from you specifically. It's a habit I built a long time ago, keeping this part of my life separate from personal relationships, because I've learned the hard way that once people know the scope of it, everything changes. How they talk to me, what they want from me, whether their kindness is genuine or strategic. I wanted for once to build something without that shadow hanging over it. And you didn't think that was something I deserved to know, given everything I've shared with you, given what I just went through with someone else keeping secrets from me." The comparison landed visibly, Nathaniel's expression flickering with something close to hurt. "I understand why it feels that way. But Mia, I promise you, this isn't the same as what Daniel did. I never lied to protect a betrayal. I simply didn't lead with a detail I've learned tends to overshadow everything else about who I actually am." Mia sat quietly for a long moment, turning his words over, trying to separate genuine understanding from the raw, reflexive hurt still coursing through her. Rationally, she recognized the difference between withholding a detail out of self-protection and actively deceiving someone for personal gain. But emotionally, in the wake of everything she had survived over the past several months, the instinct to protect herself from further blindsiding felt too strong to simply set aside. "I need some space to think about this," she said finally, standing from the table despite the shift still having hours left to run. She asked a coworker to cover her remaining tables, citing a sudden headache, and left the cafe earlier than she had in months, walking home through the cool evening air with her thoughts churning in uneasy circles. It was during this same uncertain stretch, as Mia pulled back from her usual evening visits with Nathaniel, unsure how to reconcile the two versions of him now competing for space in her understanding, that Daniel resurfaced with unexpected persistence. He had heard, through the same web of mutual friends and acquaintances that had once carried news of his own betrayal to Mia, that she had been spending time with a wealthy, influential man, the details growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until the story reaching Daniel's ears bore only passing resemblance to the actual, careful friendship Mia had built over months. He began calling again, after weeks of blessed silence following the settlement, his messages taking on a new, urgent tone that Mia recognized immediately as jealousy dressed up in the language of concern. "I heard you're seeing someone," he said, when she finally answered one call out of sheer exhaustion at his persistence, hoping to end the pattern of unanswered calls once and for all. "Someone with money, apparently. I just want to make sure you're not making a mistake, rushing into something for the wrong reasons." "That's not your concern anymore, Daniel. I still care about you, Mia, whatever you think of me right now. I know I made a terrible mistake, but I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I really believe we could find our way back to something if you just give me the chance to prove I've changed." Mia felt a familiar, weary frustration rise in her chest, the same exhausted disbelief she had felt during his earliest attempts at reconciliation months before. "You spent our wedding fund on gifts for Chloe, Daniel. You lied to me for months. There is no version of us finding our way back to anything. People make mistakes. I was scared, stressed about the wedding, and I let it push me towards something I shouldn't have. But I've had time to reflect, and I know now what I actually want, and it's you, it's always been you." The timing of his sudden, urgent reconsideration, arriving precisely when rumors of Mia's growing closeness to a wealthy, influential man had begun circulating, was not lost on her. She recognized, with a clarity she had not fully possessed months earlier, that Daniel's renewed interest had far less to do with genuine remorse, and far more to do with the sting of watching someone else potentially claim what he had so carelessly discarded. "I'm going to hang up now, Daniel, and I need you to stop calling. Not because I'm seeing anyone, and not because I'm angry, though I still am. Because there's nothing left here for either of us to salvage, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner we can both actually move forward." She ended the call before he could respond, sitting alone in her small apartment in the growing dusk, feeling the strange, layered weight of the day's revelations settling over her. She had spent the afternoon reconciling one difficult truth about a man she was beginning to care for, only to spend the evening firmly closing the door on another man whose true character she now understood far more clearly than she once had. Lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her quiet apartment, Mia found herself thinking not about Daniel's persistent attempts at reconciliation, which barely registered any more beyond mild irritation, but about Nathaniel's expression at the cafe table, the visible hurt beneath his careful explanation, the genuine regret in his voice when he admitted he should have told her sooner. She thought about the months of honest conversation, the steady, patient kindness he had shown her without ever once asking for anything in return, the wisdom in his advice about the settlement, offered not from careless privilege, but from a place of hard-won understanding about what it meant to fight for what one deserved. She thought about the vulnerability in his own admission about his failed marriage, the careful, deliberate way he had built walls around a painful past, walls not so different from the ones she herself had been building since Daniel's betrayal. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally began pulling at the edges of her exhausted mind, the question was not whether Nathaniel had been wrong to keep this part of himself hidden for a while. The real question was whether the man she had come to know across those quiet evening conversations, patient, honest in every way that mattered, genuinely kind without ever expecting anything in return, was real enough to trust with the fuller truth now finally revealed. Nearly 2 weeks passed before Mia returned to her usual evening shifts at the cafe with anything resembling her old ease. She had not avoided Nathaniel entirely during that stretch, exchanging a few brief, polite messages when their schedules happened to overlap, but the easy warmth that had defined their friendship for months remained carefully guarded on both sides, neither of them quite certain how to bridge the distance the magazine article had opened between them. It was Nathaniel who finally reached out directly, sending a message one Sunday afternoon asking if she would be willing to meet him somewhere other than the cafe, somewhere they could talk without the pressure of her shift interrupting the conversation. Mia considered the request for the better part of an hour before agreeing, suggesting a small park near her apartment, neutral ground that belonged to neither of their separate worlds. He arrived precisely on time, dressed casually in a way that reminded her instantly of the man she had first come to know, rather than the polished figure from the magazine photograph that had unsettled her so deeply weeks earlier. They walked slowly along the park's winding path, the autumn air crisp around them, for several minutes before either of them spoke. "I've thought a lot about what you said," Nathaniel finally began. "About deserving to know, given everything you'd shared with me, you were right. I let an old habit, one built out of self-protection, get in the way of being fully honest with someone who had earned that honesty many times over." "I understand why you did it," Mia said, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant it now, after weeks of turning the situation over in her mind. "I really do. I just needed some time to separate what happened with you from what happened with Daniel. They're not the same thing, I know that now." "They're not," Nathaniel agreed quietly. "But I understand why the timing made it feel that way, at least at first." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer before Nathaniel spoke again, his tone shifting into something more careful, more deliberate. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know up front that whatever your answer is, it won't change anything about how I feel toward you, or how often I hope to keep seeing you at that cafe table." "All right," Mia said, curious despite the careful weight of his introduction. "My company recently acquired a small chain of boutique retail spaces, part of a broader investment in local fashion and design. We're looking for someone to help manage and revitalize one of the flagship locations, someone with real retail experience, a strong sense for what customers actually want, and the leadership skills to build a team from the ground up. I think you'd be extraordinary at it." Mia stopped walking, turning to face him fully, an uncomfortable knot forming immediately in her stomach. "Nathaniel, I can't take a job from you, not like this." "I understand the concern," he said gently, "and I promise you I anticipated it. This isn't charity, Mia, and it isn't an attempt to buy your trust back after the magazine situation. I run a company that genuinely needs someone with your exact skill set for this role. I've watched you handle an entire cafe floor under pressure without ever losing your composure. I've heard you talk in detail about merchandising strategies and customer retention at the boutique where you currently work, ideas that go well beyond what most managers in that position ever bother developing. You'd be earning this position on merit, not favor. But you'd be the one deciding to hire me. How could that ever feel like merit, knowing what I know now about who you are?" "That's a fair concern," Nathaniel said. "So here's what I'll offer instead. The hiring decision won't be mine. My operations director, a woman named Alina who has run our retail division for 6 years and has never once let personal connections influence her hiring choices, will interview you exactly as she would any other candidate. If she doesn't think you're the right fit, the position goes to someone else, and I promise you I won't interfere either way." Mia considered this for a long moment, walking again slowly beside him as she weighed the offer against every instinct telling her to protect her independence, the hard-won sense of self-sufficiency she had built so carefully over the past several months since Daniel's betrayal. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Nathaniel said. "There's no pressure here, Mia. I'd rather you turn it down than take it feeling like you owed me something." She thought about it for the better part of a week, discussing the offer at length with Rachel, who encouraged her cautiously to at least attend the interview, reasoning that an honest evaluation of her skills against the role's requirements would tell her far more about whether the opportunity was genuine than simply speculating about it from a distance. Mia finally agreed, reaching out to Alina directly rather than through Nathaniel, determined to keep the process as separate from their personal relationship as possible. The interview, when it finally happened, left Mia genuinely surprised by its rigor. Alina, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, asked detailed questions about inventory management, staff training philosophies, and specific strategies Mia had used to improve sales at her current boutique. Questions that clearly expected substantive answers rather than polished platitudes. Mia found herself speaking with a confidence and clarity she had not fully appreciated she possessed, drawing on years of quiet, underappreciated expertise she had built in a role that had never fully recognized her potential. 2 days later, Alina called with an offer, explaining candidly that Mia's approach to customer retention and her instinct for balancing inventory with actual community demand had impressed her more than any other candidate interviewed for the position. Mia accepted, still carrying a small, careful uncertainty about how the new arrangement might affect her growing relationship with Nathaniel, but increasingly confident that the opportunity itself was genuine, earned rather than given. The transition into her new role proved challenging in the best possible way. The boutique she took over had been underperforming for years under previous management, its inventory poorly matched to the neighborhood's actual customer base, its staff undertrained and demoralized by a lack of clear direction. Mia threw herself into the work with an energy she had not felt in years, restructuring the inventory selection, implementing new training programs for the small staff she inherited, and building relationships with local designers whose work she believed deserved a stronger platform than the boutique had previously offered them. Within 3 months, sales at the location had climbed by a margin that surprised even Alina, who began sending Mia to help consult on struggling locations elsewhere in the small chain, a vote of confidence that filled Mia with a quiet, hard-earned pride, unlike anything she had experienced in her previous role. Throughout this period, her relationship with Nathaniel deepened steadily, built now on a foundation of full honesty rather than the careful vagueness that had once shadowed their early months together. He respected the boundaries she had set clearly from the beginning, never once involving himself in decisions related to her role, celebrating her successes with the same genuine enthusiasm he had always shown, without ever suggesting his own influence deserved any credit for her achievements. They continued meeting at the cafe some evenings, though increasingly their time together expanded beyond those familiar walls. Quiet dinners at unassuming restaurants Nathaniel clearly chose for their calm privacy, rather than any impressive display of his wealth. Long walks through the city discussing everything from books to business philosophy to the small, ordinary details of their respective days. "I've been thinking," Mia said one evening, several months into her new role, as they walked together along a quiet riverside path, "about how different this feels from anything I've had before. Not just with you, but in general. I used to think a relationship meant finding someone to build a life around. Now I think it means finding someone who respects the life you're already building on your own." Nathaniel glanced at her, something warm and steady in his expression. "That's exactly how it feels to me too. I spent a long time believing I needed to keep certain parts of myself separate from anyone I let close, because I'd learned the hard way what happens when people are drawn more to what you have than who you are. But you've never once asked me for anything, Mia. Not the job, not anything since. You built this success entirely on your own effort, and I think that's precisely why I trust what's growing between us more than I've trusted anything in a very long time." Mia smiled, feeling a quiet, steady certainty settle over her that she had not expected to feel again so completely after everything she had survived. She had rebuilt her life piece by careful piece, first through sheer necessity, then through growing confidence, and finally, unexpectedly, alongside a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. She did not know yet exactly where this next chapter would lead, whether the quiet, steady warmth building between them would eventually deepen into the kind of lasting commitment she had once believed impossible for herself again. But walking beside him in the cool evening air, confident in her own hard-won independence and genuinely, cautiously hopeful about what the future might hold, Mia felt something she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely like herself again. A year had passed since the night Mia walked into her old apartment and found her entire future unraveling in a matter of seconds. Standing now in the doorway of her boutique on a bright Saturday morning, watching a steady stream of customers move through racks she had curated with her own hands, Mia found it strange to remember how distant and impossible this version of her life had once seemed during those darkest weeks on her sister's couch. Wedding dress still zipped away in the back of a closet neither of them had known quite what to do with. The boutique had become one of the strongest performing locations in the small chain Nathaniel's company had acquired, its transformation attracting enough attention that Alina had recently approached Mia with an offer to oversee training and development strategy across all 6 locations. A significant step up that Mia had accepted after careful consideration. Proud of an achievement she knew, with complete certainty now, had been earned entirely on her own merit. Her confidence had grown alongside her career, a quiet, steady transformation she noticed most clearly in small moments, the ease with which she now negotiated with suppliers who had once intimidated her, the calm authority in her voice when training new staff members, the simple, grounded certainty she carried into every decision, no longer second-guessing her own judgment the way she had in the immediate aftermath of Daniel's betrayal. Daniel himself had not entirely disappeared from her life, though his presence had dwindled to occasional, unwelcome intrusions rather than the persistent campaign of the previous year. He had reached out again several months earlier, this time through a mutual friend rather than directly, asking if Mia might be willing to meet for coffee, framing the request as simple closure rather than reconciliation. Mia had agreed, more out of curiosity than any lingering hope, wanting to see for herself whether the man who had once meant everything to her still held any power over her emotions. They met at a small cafe unconnected to either of their usual haunts, and within the first 10 minutes, Mia understood with complete clarity that whatever power Daniel had once held over her heart had long since faded into nothing more than a distant, faintly uncomfortable memory. He had looked older, more tired, the easy charm she once found so appealing now reading as something closer to desperation. He spoke about Chloe, whose relationship with him had ended within months of Mia's discovery, both of them apparently unable to build anything lasting from a foundation rooted in betrayal. He spoke, too, about regret, about the mistakes he wished he could undo, and though Mia recognized genuine remorse somewhere beneath his words, she felt no corresponding pull toward forgiveness that extended beyond simple, distant civility. "I hope you find happiness, Daniel," she said finally, standing to leave after nearly an hour of careful, measured conversation. "I mean that sincerely. But I've built a life now that I'm proud of, and there's no version of the future where that life includes trying again with you." "I understand," he said quietly, and something in his expression suggested he finally, truly did, the last flickering hope of reconciliation extinguishing completely in the space of that simple, firm sentence. She left the cafe that afternoon feeling lighter than she had in months, a final, quiet closing of a chapter she had spent an entire year working to move beyond. Walking home through familiar streets, she found herself thinking not about the past she had just closed the door on, but about the future steadily building itself around her, most significantly around the man who had become, over the course of this transformative year, the steadiest and most trusted presence in her life. Her relationship with Nathaniel had deepened into something neither of them fully named for a long while, both cautious after their respective histories, both determined to build something slowly, deliberately, rather than rushing toward labels neither felt fully ready to claim. But somewhere over the past several months, without either of them marking the precise moment it happened, the relationship had settled into an unmistakable, comfortable certainty. Weekends spent together, holidays introduced to each other's families, a steady partnership built on the same foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had defined their friendship from its very beginning. It was on an ordinary evening in early autumn, almost exactly a year after their first meeting in the hotel cafe, that everything shifted into its next, deeper chapter. Nathaniel had asked her to dinner at a small, unassuming restaurant they had grown fond of over the past year, a place with no particular grandeur, chosen precisely for its quiet, unpretentious familiarity rather than any impressive display. They had just finished their meal, lingering over the last of a shared dessert, when Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand, his expression more serious than she had seen in some time. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to know it's not coming from anywhere except complete honesty." Mia felt her heart quicken slightly, though nothing in his tone suggested anything but warmth. "Okay. A year ago, I sat in that cafe mostly out of habit, work convenient to that particular hotel, nothing more deliberate than that. I never expected to find someone there who would completely reshape how I thought about what I actually wanted from my life. But watching you this past year, rebuilding everything from nothing, refusing every shortcut I might have offered you, insisting on earning your success entirely through your own effort and skill, I've come to admire you more than I've admired anyone in longer than I can remember." Mia felt tears gathering, warm and unguarded, entirely different from the tears that had defined so much of the previous year. "I'm not saying this because I want to rescue you from anything," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and sure. "You never needed rescuing. You built this entire life back up on your own strength, and I've simply had the privilege of watching it happen. I'm saying this because I love you, Mia, not as someone I feel protective toward, but as an equal, someone whose strength and resilience genuinely inspire me. I want to build a future with you, whatever shape that takes, whenever you're ready for it." Mia sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of his words, feeling the profound difference between this declaration and every promise Daniel had once made her. A difference rooted not in the scale of Nathaniel's wealth or influence, but in the simple, steady respect underlying every word he had just spoken. "I love you too," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion but entirely certain. "And I think, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm actually ready for whatever comes next." They sat together for a long while after that, the restaurant slowly emptying around them, talking quietly about the future in the unhurried, honest way that had defined their entire relationship from its very first evening together. Neither of them rushed toward specific plans or timelines, content instead to simply exist in the warm certainty of having found, against every difficult odd the previous year had thrown at them both, exactly the kind of steady, equal partnership each had once believed themselves incapable of finding again. Months later, on a quiet weekend morning, Nathaniel proposed, not with elaborate spectacle or public grandeur, but in the small, private garden behind his home, early morning light filtering through the trees. A simple ring in a simple box, offered with the same steady, unhurried sincerity that had defined every moment of their relationship from its very beginning. Mia said yes without hesitation, understanding now, with complete clarity, the fundamental difference between this proposal and the one she had once accepted from Daniel. This was not a future built on assumptions or convenient blindness, but one built on a full year of honest conversation, earned trust, and mutual respect between two people who had each, in their own separate ways, rebuilt themselves from the wreckage of past betrayals into stronger, wiser versions of who they had once been. Their wedding, when it came the following spring, bore little resemblance to the elaborate plans Mia had once made for a ceremony that never happened. It was smaller, quieter, attended by family and the small circle of genuine friends who had stood beside her through the hardest year of her life, Rachel serving as her maid of honor this time, her speech filled with genuine tears of joy rather than the empty rehearsed sentiment Chloe had once promised and never delivered. Standing at the altar, watching Nathaniel wait for her with the same warm, steady expression he had worn from their very first real conversation in that quiet corner cafe, Mia felt the full, complete arc of the past 2 years settle into place. The shattering betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything she believed her life would be, transformed instead into the beginning of a story far richer, and more genuinely hers than anything she could have imagined during those dark, uncertain months on her sister's couch. She had not needed rescuing, not really, though the kindness of a stranger over a spilled cup of coffee had certainly opened a door she might not have found on her own. What she had needed, and what she had ultimately built for herself through sheer determination and quiet, steady courage, was the chance to rediscover her own strength, to rebuild her sense of self entirely on her own terms before ever allowing someone new fully into her heart again. Walking down the aisle toward Nathaniel, surrounded by the people who had supported her through the darkest chapter of her life, Mia understood with complete certainty that the woman standing there, confident, capable, entirely her own person, bore little resemblance to the shattered woman who had once knelt on a closet floor discovering the full extent of a betrayal she never saw coming. That woman had needed time, patience, and the courage to rebuild slowly rather than rushing toward easy comfort. This woman, standing tall and certain on the happiest day of her life, understood that the truest transformation had never been about finding a wealthy man to change her fate, but about finding, through great difficulty and even greater resilience, the strength to change it entirely herself, with a partner beside her now who admired that strength more than anything else about her. As Nathaniel took her hands at the altar, his eyes bright with the same warmth that had first drawn her attention over a spilled cup of coffee nearly 2 years earlier, Mia Bennett stepped fully and completely into the future she had built, brick by careful brick, out of the ruins of the one that had once been taken from her, certain now, beyond any doubt, that this new beginning was entirely, unmistakably her own. 2 years into their marriage, Mia stood before a small crowd gathered in the community room of the very boutique that had once given her the chance to rebuild her career from nothing, though the space now served a very different purpose on Thursday evenings. What had begun as a quiet idea, whispered to Nathaniel one night over dinner, had grown into something Mia could hardly have imagined during those difficult early months of starting over. The idea had come to her gradually, sparked by a conversation with a young woman named Grace, who had joined the boutique staff the previous year, fresh out of a relationship that had left her financially and emotionally depleted in ways painfully familiar to Mia's own experience. Listening to Grace describe her own struggle to rebuild confidence after betrayal, Mia had felt a quiet, persistent pull toward doing something more deliberate with the hard-won wisdom her own difficult year had taught her. She brought the idea to Nathaniel carefully, half expecting him to suggest funding some large, impersonal program run by professionals rather than her own direct involvement. Instead, he had listened with the same quiet attentiveness he always offered her, then asked simply what kind of support she wished someone had offered her during those darkest weeks after Daniel's betrayal. Practical things, Mia had said after real thought. Not just emotional support, though that mattered enormously too, but real, practical guidance. How to protect your finances when a relationship ends badly. How to rebuild a resume after years spent supporting someone else's career. How to trust your own judgment again, after someone has deliberately undermined it. Within months, with Nathaniel's foundation providing modest funding but deliberately staying out of the program's direct operation, Mia had built a small mentorship initiative for women navigating exactly the kind of upheaval she herself had survived. The program paired participants with volunteer mentors from various professional backgrounds, offered practical workshops on financial independence and career rebuilding, and provided a simple, judgment-free space for women to share their experiences without the pressure of performing resilience they did not yet feel. Standing before this Thursday evening small gathering, Mia watched familiar faces settle into their seats, women at various stages of rebuilding lives that had been unexpectedly upended, some newly arrived and still carrying the raw, shell-shocked expression she remembered wearing herself, others further along, beginning to reclaim pieces of confidence and independence long buried beneath the weight of betrayal. "I want to start tonight," Mia said, "by telling you something I wish someone had told me clearly during my own worst weeks. The version of your life that just ended was never the only version available to you. It felt that way, I know. It felt like the future had been decided and then stolen away, leaving nothing behind but wreckage. But wreckage, as it turns out, is simply raw material. What you build from it is still entirely up to you." She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, sharing pieces of her own story with the same steady honesty that had once drawn Nathaniel to trust her so completely during their early evenings together at the cafe. She spoke about the discovery of Daniel's betrayal, the exhausting months of rebuilding, the mistakes she made along the way, learning to trust again, and the eventual hard-won confidence that had allowed her to build a life and career entirely her own before ever letting someone new fully into her heart. After the session ended, as the small group broke into quieter conversations over coffee and pastries donated weekly by a local bakery Mia had recruited as a program sponsor, Grace approached her with a small, grateful smile. "I got the job," Grace said. "The one I interviewed for last week, the marketing position I was so nervous about." "I knew you would," Mia said, pulling her into a brief, warm hug. "You've worked incredibly hard for this." "I don't think I would have applied at all if it weren't for this program," Grace admitted. "6 months ago, I couldn't imagine believing in myself enough to even try." Moments like this had become the quiet, steady heartbeat of Mia's life, beyond the boutique chain she continued to help oversee. A reminder of how far she herself had traveled from that devastating night in her old apartment, and a source of genuine, hard-earned purpose she had not expected to find so meaningfully woven into her new life. Nathaniel arrived toward the end of the evening, as he often did on these Thursday nights, not to oversee or involve himself in the program's direction, but simply to help with the quiet logistics of closing up afterward, stacking chairs, gathering leftover materials, offering rides home to participants without their own transportation. He never made a show of his involvement, content to remain largely in the background of a program that Mia had built and continued to run entirely according to her own vision. "Good session?" he asked, as they walked together to the car afterward, the evening air cool and comfortable around them. "Grace got the marketing job," Mia said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "That's wonderful. She's worked incredibly hard." "She has, they all have. It's strange," Mia added, glancing at him as they walked, how much this program has given back to me, honestly. I thought I was building it to help other women, and I have, I think, genuinely. But every session reminds me all over again how far I've come, how much stronger I am now than I ever imagined possible during those first terrible weeks. You built something real, Mia. Not just for yourself, but for every woman who walks through that door feeling like her future has been stolen from her. That's an extraordinary thing to have created. They drove home together through familiar streets, comfortable silence settling between them in the easy way it always did after these Thursday evenings, both of them tired in the satisfied way that comes from meaningful work rather than mere exhaustion. Mia looked out the window at the city passing by, thinking about the winding, difficult path that had brought her to this exact moment, the devastating betrayal that had once felt like the absolute end of everything she believed her life would be, transformed instead into the foundation for a life richer, stronger, and far more genuinely her own than anything she could have imagined during those darkest early days. She thought of Grace and the dozens of other women who had passed through the small mentorship program over the past year, each carrying their own version of the same painful story, each slowly discovering, as Mia herself had discovered, that betrayal, however devastating, did not have to be the final chapter of their story. It could instead become simply the difficult middle, the necessary turning point before an entirely new and unexpected beginning. At home that evening, settling into the quiet comfort of the life she and Nathaniel had built together, Mia felt a deep, settled gratitude for every difficult step of the journey that had led her here, the heartbreak she never would have chosen but could no longer imagine her life without having survived. It had taught her resilience she never knew she possessed, introduced her to a partner who valued her strength above all else, and given her the unexpected, meaningful purpose of helping other women discover that same resilience within themselves. The future stretched ahead of her now, open and full of possibility in a way it had not felt in longer than she could remember, built not on the fragile foundation of assumptions and convenient blindness that had once defined her relationship with Daniel, but on hard-earned strength, genuine partnership, and the quiet, powerful knowledge that whatever came next, she possessed within herself everything necessary to meet it with courage. Mia Bennett had lost everything once, in the space of a single devastating evening. But in the 2 years since, she had built something far more valuable than what had been taken from her, a life entirely her own, chosen deliberately and built with steady, patient courage, standing now as proof to every woman who walked through her Thursday evening program that even the most shattering betrayal could become, in time, simply the beginning of an entirely new and unexpectedly beautiful story.